Welcome, folks, to a special History with Tony presentation. Errol asked me to do something on Native American Heritage Month, and I was just more than happy to do this. So let's get started. I want to welcome each one of you. Like I said, this is kind of a special presentation. We're going to deal with the history of the indigenous peoples of this nation. It's a long and complex history. It's full of splendor. It's full of majesty. It's also full of conflict and shame. Now, I'm going to take a little bit different approach to this. I know most of us have heard about the stories of Native Americans. We all know about Squanto and Pocahontas and Sacagawea and Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse and Geronimo. These are stories that we've heard our whole life. And to tell that whole story of the Native American history would take absolutely months and hundreds, if not thousands, of slides. It would be a long presentation. So I'm limiting today's presentation to what's generally called pre-contact history. I'm going to do a brief overview of life and culture of the indigenous peoples in America prior to the settlement of America by the Europeans. We're going to look at the Native Americans in their purest context before they were, I guess you can say, contaminated by the European settlement. By doing this, my intent is to just really make sure that you understand that long before Columbus and Cortez and De Soto and Standish and Rolfe and Marquette and Joliet, all these adventurers and explorers that we've heard about all of our life, ventured into the North American continent, that there was a rich and very colorful history that was already present long before Coronado came here to look for those 7 cities of gold, which, by the way, he never found. One of the reasons I'm so honored to have been asked to do this is because I'm the great-great-great-grandson of both a Choctaw woman, her name was Alabeth Ball Freeman, and a Cherokee woman, Sarah Jane Edgar Couch. So with that being said, let's begin our story at how the first humans arrived in the Western Hemisphere to become the first Americans. And I do want to show you a picture and make sure you believe what I'm saying. This is a picture of Elijah Couch and Sarah Jane Edgar Couch that was taken somewhere about 10 years after the Civil War. You can definitely tell she's Cherokee. By the way, they lived on the grounds of Wilson's Creek National Battlefield. She is buried there, along with her daughter and several relatives, in a private cemetery on the grounds of the National Battlefield called the Edgar Cemetery. On the right-hand side is the Topaz Mill, which was built by Aaron Freeman, my great-great-great-grandfather, and his wife, Alabeth, who was Choctaw. That is not the original mill. This one was built about 1890, but it's built exactly on the same grounds as the first mill was built on the Topaz Spring in Douglas County, Missouri. So like I said, I'm very proud of my Native American heritage. It means a great deal to me. So how did our first Native Americans get here? Well, of course, it's all prehistory. And with prehistory, I've told you before, if you've ever been involved with anything I've talked to you about, kind of looking into a fog bank. It's really difficult to tell these things with any kind of authenticity. We think they would have arrived here around 20,000 BC. And when they got here, they would have spread pretty rapidly southward, mainly into Central and South America. They didn't stay long on the North American continent. Once they got into Central and South America, then they began moving back northward. It's believed that they crossed in North America over an ancient land bridge called Beringia that connected present-day Alaska and Russia. That land bridge had been exposed because of the massive glaciers that had formed in the last ice age. Those had dropped the sea levels up to 400 feet. And they were chasing after these migratory herds of these prehistoric animals that existed, mammoths, and giant bison, giant beavers, all these prehistoric animals that existed then that no longer exist today. They were probably chasing after them, and they headed down through ice-free corridors into North and South America. They're usually referred to, these first Americans are referred to as part of the Clovis culture, named after a specific type of fluted spear point that was found in Clovis, New Mexico around 1933. Now, there's two other theories about how they may have got here. Some people think they got here from what was known as Australasia, which was Southeast Asia, Australia and Southeast Asia. They believe they may have sailed here in primitive sailboats. There's another group of people that think they even got here from Europe by skin boats. But there's not really a lot of evidence to support those theories. May have happened, may not have happened. Who knows? It may have happened with all three. We just don't know. I'll be honest with you. This is what scientists think Beringia would have looked like. The dark brown is what present-day Siberia and Alaska are. There's only about a 20-mile difference right there between the Bering Strait, and it's a very narrow and very shallow part of the sea. The tan part would have been what would have been exposed from the Ice Age. So you can see there was a fairly large land bridge that connected Asia and North America at the height of the Ice Age. And again, they were following these prehistoric animals, and these are representations of these giant mammoths and bison and other critters that would have roamed. Now, the earliest indigenous cultures, as I said, spread very rapidly. And by 1500 AD or so, it had pretty much spread all over North and South America, predominantly South America. Nobody knows for sure, but estimates are up to as many as 4 million Native Americans would have existed at this period of time. They were very primitive people. They were Neolithic, New Stone Age people. They were hunters and gatherers, and they kind of grouped together into tribal units, but they were not sophisticated at all. They used stone tools. They had domesticated some plants and animals, maize, beans, and squash, which we'll hear more about in a few minutes. Animals, the dog and the turkey. They had settled in somewhat permanent villages, small villages. They had developed pottery and weaving. And as these tribes spread throughout America, they developed a range of languages, distinct cultures, primarily because of the environments that they were existing in. Because again, we all know the different environments that exist in North and South America. There's arid deserts, there's frigid mountainous areas, and all the cultures developed according to the environment in which they live. And so there were quite a disparity of cultures here. Just for example, here is an actual photograph of, I believe this was an Osage dwelling that would have been taken late in the 19th century. These are the crops. These are the corn, the maize, the squash, the pumpkins, and the squash. These were known as the Three Sisters. They had the Native Americans developed a very unique agrarian practice. They would plant the corn, and then they would plant the beans right in the same hill. And the beans would come up and curl around the corn stalks, and the squash would be planted in the same place, and it would make a ground cover, which would prevent the weeds. They're very ingenious, and they were known as the Three Sisters. And this was the primary crops that most Native Americans used for food products. They did create pottery. It wasn't real sophisticated, but they did decorate it. This is a very early piece of pottery. And this is one of those Clovis spear points that I was talking to you about, made out of stone. And they had not developed metallurgy yet. They had not, they would a little bit later, but they basically used, stone points for their implements. Now, over a period of time, some of these cultures, some of these primitive cultures developed into civilizations. Now, there are three distinct locations that we know that developed into civilizations. One of them was the Maya, around 250 to 1697 AD. Another was the Aztec, about 1300 to 1521 AD. And the Inca, from about 1200 to about 1533. Now, these are all approximate dates, but these give you some idea of the three civilizations. They all shared common characteristics, and these characteristics are common to all ancient civilizations. They had advanced cities. They had large cities, as you'll see. They had a complex division of labor. There was a hierarchy of labor. There were, lower class, middle class, upper class, you might say. They had complex institutions, government institutions, religious institutions. They did monumental architecture. They had unique art styles that were involved in this. They had a shared communication. A hallmark of any civilization is an alphabet, a writing system. All three of these also developed numeric systems. Advanced technology to being things like astronomy, mathematics, toolmaking. They were very advanced. The Maya were extremely advanced in areas of mathematics and astronomy, for instance, much far advanced than some of their European counterparts at the time. All three of these civilizations, as I said, were heavily dependent on the cultivation of the maize, the beans, and squash, the three sisters. Both the Aztec and Inca civilizations, of course, if you know your history, they were ultimately conquered by Spanish conquistadors, while the Mayan civilization had pretty much peaked by 900 AD, and even though it existed some years later, about, probably another 700 years or so, by the time the Spanish conquistadors had found them, they were pretty much deteriorated to the point that they were not a threat or an advanced civilization. Here is a map. This is where the Incas were, along the Andes mountain range on the western coast of South America. It was a very long and narrow civilization. The Maya were up here in the Yucatan Peninsula, and the Aztec were centered around what would then Mexico City and the area to the south of it. Now, you notice up here in North America, there are two shaded areas. This is something that became known as the mound builders culture. They did not reach the hallmarks of a civilization, nor did the Anasazi, which are located over here in the western part in what we now know as the Four Corners area of New Mexico, Arizona, Utah, and Colorado. These people did not reach that hallmark either of civilization, but they did reach a very high level of culture. We're going to talk about each one of these real briefly here. So let's look at the Aztec. The Aztec called themselves Mexica. That was their term for themselves. That's where, of course, we get the word Mexico. They lived in present-day central Mexico. Their capital was called Tenochtitlan, which is now the present city of Mexico City. And at its height, historians believe they would have reached maybe as big as 300,000 people. I mean, that's a huge city, folks. They had a written language. They had designed and implemented sophisticated irrigation systems. They had a highly structured political and social structure. They did practice human sacrifice, which they believed ensured fertility not only for their people, but also their crops. They primarily sacrificed their enemies. One of the best remaining ruins is the Pyramid of the Sun, which I'm going to bet somebody out there that's listening to this has probably been to the Pyramid of the Sun. It was located at a ritual city called Teotihuacan. The Aztec Empire was conquered in 1521 by the Spanish conquistador Hernan Cortez, with the assistance of some indigenous tribes who were subservient to the Aztecs. Not all Native Americans got along with each other. Trust me, folks. They were warlike enemies, a lot of them, before we got there. They practiced war quite a bit. The Maya was located, as I've said, in the Yucatan Peninsula. They were centered in this peninsula. They had large cities. They utilized advanced irrigation water storage techniques. They constructed massive structures for their rulers who were considered divine. They made advanced developments in astronomy and mathematics, very far advanced systems of mathematics and astronomy, resulting in a calendar system which was very intricate and had one of the most highly developed writing systems in pre-contact era. During the 9th century AD, the Mayan civilization suffered a major political collapse. We don't know exactly what happened. We just know it was there, and then all of a sudden, it almost wasn't there. It really began to deteriorate very rapidly. It could have been warfare. It could have been overpopulation. They may have just had too many people. It could have been drought. There are all sorts of consequences to what could have happened to the Mayan civilization. We just know that it pretty rapidly deteriorated. Much so to the point that by the 16th century, when the early conquistadors found what was left of the Mayan civilization, it was just a shell of its former empire. There are literally hundreds of ruins of the Mayan civilization. And again, I'm going to guess some people out there that are listening to this have probably on one of their cruise trips have made some side journeys to some of these Mayan ruins. One of the most famous is the Pyramid of Kukulkan at Chichen Itza. And this is that pyramid there. These were not as big as the pyramids that were located in Egypt, but they were just as magnificent. And in some ways, I think probably a little bit more so. Now, the Incas, as I've said, were located primarily along the western shore of South America along the Andes mountain range. And they actually went up into the Andes Mountains. It was the largest of these three empires. And their capital city was the city of Cusco. It encompassed 16 million people, the whole empire did, covered about 350,000 square miles. And they had a tremendous success. They were very rich. They had a large population. They were probably, in many ways, the most sufficient of all these three civilizations. That's because they had ample food. They had a good environment of which to have this. They were finally conquered by a band of conquistadors by the name of, led by Juan Pizarro. And again, if you know your history, you probably know that. There are all sorts of ruins left, but by far and away, the most famous is a ritual city located up in the peaks of the Andes Mountains, about 8,000 feet tall, known as Machu Picchu. And once again, I'm going to bet somebody out there has been to Machu Picchu. I've known a couple of people that have been there, and they said it was probably one of the best things that they ever saw, was making this journey up to this ritual city. Now, in North America, as I told you, there were two cultures developed that did not reach the hallmarks of civilization, but they were very advanced cultures. The first one we generally call mound builders. That's a generalized term. We call them that because they were noted for the mounds they built. Primarily they developed in what was called the Woodland period, about 800 to about 1500 AD, mainly in the Ohio and the Mississippi River valleys. So east of Missouri, in Ohio, Illinois, Indiana, in that area through there. The most impressive of these, probably two of them that really stand out. The most impressive is probably found at Cahokia, just east of St. Louis on the eastern shore of the Mississippi River. There was a mound there. There were several mounds, but the biggest one was called Monk's Mound. And they were earthen mounds. They were not built out of stone or rock. They were built out of earth, but they would have taken years to have completed. And this is a National Heritage Site, and you can go there. And I've been to Monk's Mound. I've been to Cahokia, and it's just a tremendous experience if you ever get a chance to go there. They also built what were called effigy mounds. These were mounds that were built in the form of maybe animals that they worshiped. Without a doubt, the most famous is the Great Serpent Mound found near Adena, Ohio. And I'm sure that some of my Ohio listeners are going to be familiar with this. And This is a picture of Monk's Mound up here at the upper top, and that's Mississippi River there. So you can see it's just right across the river from St. Louis. This is the Great Serpent Mound. You can see the end of its tail here, and it curls around like this, curls around, ended up with its mouth, and it has an egg in its mouth. And there's a walking trail around it, and it's a very unique situation. I've never been to Adena. I've never been to the Great Serpent Mound, but I've read about it and I've seen gobs of pictures of it. Now, as again, they did not reach the level of civilization. They were advanced. They had, many of the hallmarks of civilization. The main thing they never got was an alphabet. They just never had a written language. They were stuck in what was called pictographs. And by the time the Spanish and French explorers of the upper Midwest and in North America found them, they had pretty much been abandoned due to disease and overpopulation. Now, out in the Southwest Four Corners region, there was a culture developed called the Anasazi. And this is, again, a collective term. And again, there's some dispute exactly about what the nature of this culture was. Mostly it's regarded as the ancestors of the present-day Pueblo, Native Americans. But again, there's different ideas about this, how this all developed and what it signifies. They are probably most remembered for the rock cities that they carved out of mountains. And there are three notable ones. The most famous, without a doubt, is Mesa Verde. And this is Mesa Verde here. There was also one at Chaco Canyon, and there was one at Canyon de Chelly. And there are others, but these are by far and away the three most famous and the largest and the best developed and the best preserved that we have. Again, these cultures had pretty well deteriorated, disappeared before European explorers ever got there. So today we see these as they would have looked after they would have been abandoned. And you can visit each one of these. These are all national parks now. Now, we're going to go a little bit more in depth now into the cultural areas of North America, because after all, we live in the United States, and that's what we're interested in primarily. So prior to the arrival of the European settlers, indigenous tribes were scattered across the current U.S. and developed cultural traits adapted to the environmental landscapes where they lived. These pre-contact tribes can be roughly divided into 8 distinctive areas. They were all called cultural areas, not civilizations. Each one was primarily a Neolithic culture. They just, they were much more advanced than what we generally think of a Neolithic culture, but they were still classified as Neolithic. Basically, there are 8 areas that we can kind of designate that shows you they were all distinctly different from the other areas. So that's what we're going to look at, these 8 areas here with the next 20 minutes or so. There was the Eastern Woodland Tribes, and that was the tribes over here in the Ohio River, west east of the Mississippi River, clear over to the eastern seaboard, down around into the southern part of Tennessee and Kentucky, and maybe into the Carolinas. There was the Southeastern Woodland Tribes, which was the southeastern part of the United States. There were the Great Plains Tribes, which are the ones here in the orange, and they would have been in the Great Plains as we know it. There was the Southwestern Tribes, the New Mexico, Arizona, Western Texas, that area through there. There were the Great Basin Tribes. These were probably the most primitive of all the tribes. They were the tribes that made up the area of western Colorado, Nevada, Utah, very eastern part of California, and the southern parts of Idaho and Oregon, this area through there. The high desert tribes, as we call them. Then there was the Northern Plateau tribes. These are the ones west of the Rocky Mountains in the northern part. Again, Idaho, Washington, Oregon, these areas through there, the western part, the eastern parts of those states. The Northwest coastal tribes, which stretched clear up to Alaska, and they were centered primarily along the Pacific Northwest. And then there was the California tribes, which stretched clear down to the tip of this area through here. So let's look at each one of these Native American cultural areas as they would have been prior to the arrival of the Western Europeans. Now, the tribes designated as eastern woodlands were found in geographic areas stretching from the Atlantic Ocean to the eastern Great Plains and from the Great Lakes to the Ohio River. This is basically the area here that we're talking about. Illinois, northern Indiana, Ohio, Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, New York, New England, those areas. There were many, many tribes there, as you can see. They're all kind of divided into three main cultural language areas: the Hopewell, the Iroquois, and the Algonquin. They lived in wooden structures, wigwams, wooden longhouses, because again, this is an area that's primarily cold in the winter, particularly. And so, they needed a little bit better structural integrity in order to keep themselves safe. They were primarily hunters and gatherers. There were ample game in these areas. They did supplement their diet with the three sisters, this maize, squash, and beans. Again, there's ample rivers in this area, so they were very much involved in transportation and along the rivers. And they used birchbark canoes, which is where we got the canoe from. And they traveled along the waterways, lived in small villages, with the exception of a couple. We've already mentioned Cahokia was huge. Cahokia at its largest was one of the largest cities in the world at that time. Another one was located in the present-day city of Montreal, and I'm not even going to try to pronounce the name. I don't really know how to pronounce this name. I've never run across it before. They were somewhat aggressive, and they were very warlike, mainly amongst themselves. They had, they were opponents of each other. They didn't necessarily always get along. Once the white settler came, they began to work more closely together. This is a hallmark, again, of some of the Native American cultures. Now, this is a photograph of an Iroquois man and an Iroquois woman that was taken somewhere along the end of the 19th century in what would have been their tribal dress. And you can see this would have been how they would have dressed, and probably this is how they dressed for centuries. Generally warm compared to what we know of. Now, obviously, the man's got a gingham shirt on, it looks like. So, he probably got that from the material. But, the rest of it is probably as it represented for centuries as far back as it could be. The southeastern tribes were those located in the areas of Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, Florida, the Carolinas, maybe up into Virginia. They were called the Mississippian culture because, again, they were right along the Mississippi River, ran down through the middle of it. And again, they were primarily agrarian as opposed to the woodland Northeast tribes, which were primarily hunters and gatherers. They were farmers. And again, they had rich farmland and a good climate. It was milder, so that they could grow food the year round. They did supplement that agrarian diet with hunting and gathering. They also developed very distinctive artworks, and they had a very extensive trade network. You can find pieces of pottery and jewelry from this area all throughout the west-eastern part of the United States. If you go to Cahokia, there are remnants of jewelry that was found from the Gulf Coast area. So there was a great deal of trade developed between these areas. The 5 tribes that we are most familiar with in this area are the Cherokee, the Choctaw, the Creek, the Chickasaw, and the Seminole. They have been named the 5 civilized tribes, which I absolutely despise that name. And I'm going to be honest with you. I think it's a horrible name because it implies that they were civilized. So the rest of the Indian tribes and the American tribes must have not been civilized. I don't like that term at all. And the reason they were called that is because, unlike most tribes in North America, once they contacted the European civilization, they chose to adapt and assimilate. If you would have walked into a Cherokee village in 1820 in Georgia, you might not have known that you weren't walking into a New England village. They dressed alike. They lived in the same type houses. They owned slaves. They spoke English. They practiced Christianity to some degree. They were a very assimilated tribe. The hopes was, as they saw it, if they became American, then the Americans would respect them. It did not work out. Okay. That didn't matter because as soon as gold was found there, we coveted their land. And as a result, we decided to relocate a lot of these tribes, mainly to the western part in what was known as Indian Territory, what we now know as Oklahoma. And of course, we all, I'm sure, are familiar with the term the Trail of Tears, which was this forced relocation program in the 1830s, where we basically just rounded these Indian tribes up and forced them west, took their lands. It was a horrible stain up on our history, and it's one of the more despicable things I think that this country has ever done. It was just a horrible situation. This is a example of Creek male and a Creek woman that were taken somewhere around the end of the 19th century. And again, this would have been how they would have dressed and had dressed for some time. Now, if you were to ask most Americans to describe an Indian, that, they're actually Native Americans, indigenous Americans, whatever you want to try. But if you ask them, said, describe an Indian to me, they would tell you, well, they rode horses, they chased the buffalo, they lived in teepees, and they were very warlike. Well, that indeed describes the Great Plains tribes to a degree. But folks, that's not how most Native Americans, that's not how they lived. This was only because the Great Plains tribes happened to live in an environment where that was something that was good. They were nomadic. They had once been a hunting farming culture that pretty well was sedentary. But once they got the horse, and the horse came in around the 1600s, they escaped from the French and the Spanish, and the Native American they found the horse, they developed it, they became superior horsemen, and they developed what was known as a horse culture. And they did become nomadic, and they did chase their huge herds of buffalo, and they did live in teepees. And although they were somewhat warlike even before their contact with the European settlers, they became very warlike once they realized what was going to happen to them, once they realized that the white men coveted their land. Of course, we're all familiar and all know the story of the Battle of the Little Bighorn, which is one of those stories that we've heard all of our life, where they defeated Colonel Custer and his command. And it's probably the best known incident of the Indian Wars in the post-Civil War era. And again, this kind of gave us the stereotype of the Native American that we have seen portrayed in TVs and movie westerns ever since. By the way, I need to make you understand something, and I kind of should have said this a little bit sooner, but I kind of forgot to tell you. One of the basic problems between the contact of the Western Europeans and the Native Americans was that Native Americans had no concept of private ownership of land. They didn't understand this. They thought the land belonged to everyone and that you took from it what you needed and you protected what you didn't need. And nobody owned the land. Well, obviously, that's not the way the European settlers believed. They came west and they came into North America primarily. One of the major reasons they came from Europe was because there was no land anymore for them to have. There was also religious and governmental subtext there and adventure and all. But one of the main reasons people came to North America in the United States to settle was because there was ample land. And, you were promised, hey, you come to America, you can own a farm of 300 acres. I mean, that was just fantastic, because, again, it's a huge country. And they came into conflict very rapidly with the Native Americans because, again, they didn't understand this. They thought that the white man was just going to come here and use the land. Once they realized they intended to own the land and keep them from using it, that's when the conflict arose. So I want to make sure you understand that. Again, this is a photograph of a Sioux man and a Sioux woman somewhere in the end of the 19th century. This would have been, again, what they would have looked like. And this is, again, the stereotypical view of what we think of when we think of a Native American. Now, the Southwestern tribes were different from all the other areas that we've talked about. They were in the region of New Mexico and Arizona. Again, there's lots of different tribes there, but you can kind of divide them up into Pueblo, Navajo, Hopi, and Apache. Now, originally, they were farmers, the three sisters. But again, as they got a hold of cattle and sheep and goats, they developed what was known as a herding culture. Originally, they lived in these cliff dwellings back before the Europeans got there. But, that just became impractical at some point. And so they began to live in what was known as hogans, which are adobe mud structures. And again, if you've ever lived in the southwestern part of the United States or been there, adobe is just a standard building, material they still use today. These southwestern tribes were originally pretty pacifistic. They were not really overly aggressive. Once again, when the white settlers began to take the land for ownership, then some of them became extremely aggressive, none more so than the Apache. Again, we are all very familiar with the story of Geronimo and the Apache Wars of the late 19th century. And they fought a guerrilla warfare against the United States longer than any other group and more successfully. It was a very difficult thing for the white government to finally overcome the Apache culture, but they did, And again, this is what you would have found prior to the arrival of the white man. Again, photographs of an Apache man, three brothers there, and a couple women. This would have been how they would have looked and lived, in this period of time. The Great Basin tribes. These were the poor relatives of the Native Americans. I hate to say that, but they lived in an area which was arid, did not have a lot of natural resources. The climate was extremely hot in the winter, extremely cold, extremely hot in the summer, extremely cold in the winter. They did not enjoy some of the natural resources the other tribes lived. As a result, they were probably more primitive than most of the other tribes. They lived, for the most part, in what were called wickiups, which was basically almost like stick cultures, stick dwellings. They lived very subsistent lives. The exception to this would have been the northern tribes of the Great Basin, the Shoshone. The Shoshone were actually almost more akin to the Plains tribes than they were the Great Basin tribes, but they are included within the Great Basin tribes. By the way, because this was such a arid area and less populated and still is today, they continued living the life they lived longer than most of the other Native Americans. That meant that they kept their indigenous religious and cultural traits longer. So it's no surprise that at the end of the 19th century, when there was a revival, kind of like a religious revival amongst the tribes of the West, that it was led by people from this area. What was called the ghost dance, which led to the most infamous event of the Plains Wars, the massacre at Wounded Knee, which we will talk about in a few minutes here. Here is a photograph of the Shoshone man and woman, and again in the late 19th century. The Northwest Plateau tribes were those tribes of western Montana, northern Idaho, Washington, Oregon, east of the Cascade Mountains, up into Canada. The Flathead, the Nez Perce, the Klamath, the Walla Walla tribes. Again, they were primarily hunters and gatherers. They lived a lot on wild game and salmon from the Columbia River. They also had an abundance of fruits, nuts, and vegetables. They were intricate basket weavers. They lived in longhouses made of woods and reeds. Again, they had to have a more substantial structure because of the climate. And they were not really known for their aggression. They were fairly peaceful tribes for the most part. As a result, once they did come into conflict with the Western Europeans people, the Americans. One of those incidents, known as Chief Joseph's War, which was between the Nez Perce and the U.S. Army, where we chased them clear across the western part of the United States, and we finally captured them just a few miles from the Canadian border. And Chief Joseph gave a speech, which was recorded, not recorded on paper. And it was a speech that had been basically gone down in history as "I will fight no more forever," which is one of the most touching, memorable speeches in American history. If you've never read it, you ought to read Chief Joseph's speech at the end of the Nez Perce flight. It's a moving speech, to say the least. Here is an example. Again, photographs taken of Nez Perce, and you can see they wore a little bit heavier clothing because they needed to where they lived. The California tribes were basically in the area we know as California, west of the Sierra Nevada mountains. And there were well over 100 tribes there. Most of them were small clannish tribes. Some of the better known, Shasta, Miwok, Selenian, Chumash, Modoc, the Mojave, they were what were called forest gardeners. Again, because there was so much abundant resources there and the climate was so mild, it was almost like an Eden, folks. There is a reason why so many people want to live in California. Well, maybe not so much today, but through history, people wanted to live in California because it's a beautiful state with a lot of environmental things. A good climate can raise a lot of food. It's got the ocean. It's got a lot of things that people like. The result was, it should come as no surprise that when the white settlers coveted their land, it was a disaster for these California tribes. They were extremely pacifistic. They were not even very aggressive towards each other. They lived in almost like an Eden-like situation. As a result, when they contacted the Spanish settlers in the 18th century and the Americans in the 19th century, it was a disaster. From disease to torture to overwork to malnourishment to outright massacres. It's one of the real stains upon the American history, what we did to the California tribes. In fact, there's a name. It's called the Genocide of California. Look at the statistics. It's estimated that at the beginning of the 19th century, there were almost 250,000 Indians, Native Americans, living in California. By the end of the 19th century, there were only an estimated 15,000 left. That's how that's how deteriorated they had become, and mainly because of the contact with the white settlers. It's not a very pleasant story. This again is a photograph of a Mojave man and a Mojave girl that was taken towards the end of the 19th century. And I have to be honest with you, that picture of that girl just haunts me. There's something about it that just really, I don't know what there is. I look at that picture, and I've looked at it lots. It kind of is a haunting picture to me for one reason or the other. The Pacific Northwest, the tribes, the last ones we're going to talk about. Tribes of the Pacific Northwest occupied the area right along the Pacific coast and northwest parts of Washington, Oregon, up into Canada, up to Alaska. And again, there were lots of tribes. Some of the biggest ones were the Tlingit, the Haida, the Salish, the Chinook, the Yurok. And again, they lived differently than most of the other Native American tribes. They lived in cedar plank cabins, and they lived almost entirely off salmon. They were big fishermen, and I mean, they dried salmon, they lived off salmon, and they had an abundance of food. So much so that they were able to produce probably some of the most beautiful and intricate artwork that of any of the Native American tribes. And again, these are some of the most highly prized, artifacts amongst the Indian tribes today. Is some of these artifacts from the Pacific Northwestern tribes. By the way, they had a very interesting, complex social custom called potlatching. Potlatching was where people gathered together to celebrate events such as raising a totem pole, a marriage, a funeral, a battle victory, and it kind of served as a competition to display wealth. They would lay out their wealth in terms of jewelry and stuff like this out in front of each other, and to kind of brag, like, hey, look what I've got compared to what you've got. I used to laugh. I worked in the school system for 38 years, and every time you walked into a high school, the first thing you saw was a trophy case. And once I became familiar with the concept of potlatching, I thought to myself, this is kind of high school potlatching. We're bragging like, hey, look what we won. Ha, you've not got this. We won the state championship here. It's kind of the same concept. So here's a picture of a elder man and woman from the Tlingit tribe. Now, there were differences, but there were common cultural traits amongst the Native Americans. They were extremely spiritual people. They shared some common beliefs. They all believed primarily in a great spirit, and they thought that the goal of your life was to live in harmony with nature. So you would be not united with nature after death with the great spirit. Folks, they were the first genuine environmentalists as we know it today. They prized the land, the air, the water, and they took only from it what they thought was needed, and they did everything they could to make sure that it was not damaged any more than needed. If they killed an animal, they would give it great respect, if you killed a deer, you would thank the deer for sacrificing its life to you so you could live. And they had a really deep religious spiritual belief. They thought that the universe was comprised of the sky, where the Great Spirit lived, the earth, where we lived, and the lower world, where the lesser spirits lived, some good, some bad. The Great Spirit was almost always personified by the sun, the life-giving sun, while the lesser spirits would be personified by animals or natural phenomena, like the bear, the buffalo, the eagle, the snake, or maybe rain, wind, and lightning. And each tribe, each cultural area would develop elaborate, diverse ceremonies and rituals to worship this great spirit. And these involved personal sacrifice, fasting, prayer. Most of the indigenous peoples were agrarian, relying upon the three sisters. However, as we mentioned, once the horse was introduced, some became a horse culture. Others became a herding culture. Those that lived along the coastal areas became a seagoing culture, a fishing culture. Most of the indigenous tribes were patriarchal. Women's status kind of varied from area to area, but for the most part, it was a very patriarchal system with men in charge. The clan system was very important, and there was a rigid social strata amongst them. On the other hand, some tribes, there was no hierarchy of power. For instance, if you were to go to the Plains tribes, we think today about the great chiefs. Those chiefs really had very little power. The men that had the power were the medicine men. You know, Sitting Bull was not a chief. Sitting Bull was a medicine man. You know, he was a shaman, and so this was very common. Again, photographs. This is a tribe along the Pacific Northwest that would worship as a lesser spirit the wolf, and you notice they're dressed up in wolf cultures here. This would have been a Plains tribe, which primarily were sun worshipers doing the sun dance. Here is something probably from the eastern part of the United States where the bear was more prevalent as being worshipped. And here amongst the Southwest, the snake culture. The snake was very much worshipped in the southwestern part of the United States. Again, every time I look at this picture, it kind of freaks me out a little bit with this guy having the snakes in his mouth. It just kind of freaks me out a little bit. So when the European settlers began to settle North and South America, the indigenous peoples were at first apprehensive, but a little bit curious. They really weren't aggressive as such. That changed really rapidly once they figured out this concept of land ownership that the European settlers brought with them. And that's when you begin to see the aggression take place. The result was that conflict between the Native Americans, the indigenous tribes, and the white settlers took place almost immediately, folks. We think of the Indian Wars as those wars that took place in the plains in the 1860s, 70s, 80s. Folks, there have been Indian Wars taking place in America from the beginning. The Jamestown Massacre in 1622, King Philip's War in the New England area, 1675 to 76. The Pueblo Vote, where the Pueblo Indians revolted against the Spanish in 1680. The French and Indian War, where the French basically got most of the Indians to work with them against the British. Pontiac's Rebellion in the Midwest, Tecumseh's War in the Midwest, the Seminole Wars in the Southeast, the Black Hawk Wars, and then again, the two wars that we're most familiar with, the Plains Wars in 1840 to 1876, and the Apache Wars of 1849 to 1886. These are the two big ones that we're more familiar with. All ended primarily with the last, in a sense, war event, which was the massacre of Wounded Knee. It was not a battle, it was a massacre. At the end of the 19th century, most indigenous tribes had been resettled on reservations controlled by the federal government, and they were forced to abandon their tribal customs. They absolutely, the federal government insisted they abandon these. Even though they suffered in poverty, reduced in population, there was a saying, the sanctioned approach was, we have to kill the Indian to save the man. I know this sounds terrible, but that was the philosophy at that time. The result was they, in a sense, went from living in Eden to near extinction. Again, not a very pleasant picture, but this is some photographs taken at the massacre at Wounded Knee in South Dakota. Just a horrible event. And if you've not read about it, you ought to read about it. It's a terrible event. So, thankfully, the government and our society's attitude towards indigenous Americans has changed dramatically since Wounded Knee. The government, as well as most Americans, now realize how much colonization and genocide negatively impacted the life of these Native Americans. I think we now realize what happened. That's why we celebrate Native American Heritage Month, because we want to celebrate their contributions. We want to recognize and give them credit, which is long overdue. The foods, the medicine, and I think most importantly, in many ways, the environmental awareness, to mention only a few. Native Americans have been unbelievable in the fact that they've served in the armed forces at a rate 5 times the national average. Even though all these injustices were done them, they still fought in record numbers for Americans. Surprisingly, most Native Americans live in metropolitan areas. The last census said 71% lived in metropolitan areas. They constitute about 2.5% of the total American population. And even though there have been huge advances made, the unfortunate reality is the societal problems of mental health, poverty, substance abuse, violence remain really high amongst these populations. And there's a lot to be done, folks. And I personally think that we ought to support every effort and endeavor to help these Native Americans. So, as a descendant of 2 great Native American grandmothers, my wish is that every American will come to appreciate and respect the richness of the Native American culture heritage, and that each of us would do what we can to contribute to the advancement of Native Americans, to which I think we all owe so much. So, with that being said, I'm going to stop here. It's been a long event, but I hope it's been worthwhile. I hope you've enjoyed what I've had to say. And, with that, I'm going to conclude my presentation.